the OBR, who, constantly are kind of assessing what we're doing in the economy and what it's going to mean for growth, is forecasting that it's not going to change very much. It's going to go up a bit, but actually, despite all these policy announcements, we're not going to get greater growth.
Yeah, of course they don't know. I mean, that's the wonderful thing. I remember once talking to a senior economist at the Office for Budget Responsibility, and I was teasing him because I think they'd got loads and loads of forecasts wrong, and he said, our job is not to be right, our job is to be independent. Which for a while,
Tim Harford is an expert in number crunching. Of course, he presents the Radio 4 show More or Less and hosts his own history podcast, Cautionary Tales. Tim, given we're in the middle of just kind of deciphering the budget, trying to work out what all that means for us, and I definitely want to ask you loads about that. But can you just give us a sense of kind of what got you into economics? And because it was game theory you were interested in, particularly, wasn't it, when you were young?
Absolutely. Well, not so much when I was young. I mean, I was always interested in games when I was young. Total board game, role-playing game nerd. But when I went to uni, I thought I was going to be a philosopher. I thought philosophy sounds really interesting. Obviously, this is what students do when they have no idea what they're going to do with their lives. They're like, I'll study philosophy.
What did you picture a philosopher to be then? Like, what were you thinking your life would be like?
Dealing with I don't know about life. I certainly had no expectations of what my life was going to be like. When the idea of going out and earning a wage, it just seemed like, how could people, and you do stuff and people give you money? How does that work? I don't know. I just seemed like totally weird. But I was young. Yeah. So anyway, I did a degree that was philosophy, politics, and economics, and I was going to drop the economics because I was never that interested in economics. And it was only at the end of the first year that one of my teachers, a wonderful man, wonderful economist called Peter Sinclair, who's sadly no longer with us, very gently, in his inimitable way, pointed out that I seem to actually be doing quite well, and maybe I may possibly consider not dropping economics. And I kind of had to think about it, and I realised this often happens. I'd kind of been on rails, like I'd made a plan, and all this new information had come in, and I hadn't changed the plan. And actually, when I took a step back with Peter's gentle nudging, I thought, actually, I love this subject. And so I stuck with economics, and the rest is history, as they say around here.
Yeah, we say that a lot around here.
I'm sure you do. But the particular part of economics that fascinated me at the time was this thing called game theory. Yeah. And game theory is about people trying to make decisions where they're trying to figure out what the other person is going to do, and the other person is trying to figure out what you're going to do. So it's rock, paper, scissors, it's poker, but it's also things like strategic nuclear deterrence or negotiations between an employer and a trade union. And I never thought of economics as being about that kind of decision making, and that's really what pulled me into the subject.
Yeah, and have your views on it changed then over the years in terms of how you think about economics and how we all, make our decisions on stuff?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, we're talking 30 years ago, so it would be a bit weird if I hadn't changed my views on some things. Yeah. So, and economics has changed as well. So just to pick a couple, one is that I'm much more interested than I was as a student in behavioural economics. So that's bringing in the psychological side of economics. And that's just fascinating because people are strange, and economists don't model people as strange. They model people, at least traditionally, they model people as kind of optimizing decision makers. But economics has got much richer in its view of human behavior. So that's one big thing. And another big thing is data. Just much more interested in the data and try to figure out like how the economy is doing, how people are doing, how we answer those questions, what we measure, the questions that we ask. Because at university, although I had a great time and I learned a lot, it was very theoretical. It was like, let's just sit in an armchair and think really hard. It wasn't actually very different from philosophy, really, after all. But when you get out there in the real world, you're like, well, is the economy doing well? Is the economy doing badly? How do people feel about it? Does this policy work or not work? And for all of that, you need to look at the data. Yeah. And that, of course, in the end, led to the BBC show More or Less, which is all about the numbers.
Yeah, you do the weirdest. I love it. It's so weird and wonderful as well, how you look at things and kind of unpick and work out, the great questions of our time, but then bring an economics lens to it. And, it's fascinating what you get asked and what you end up answering on that.
Well, yeah. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that people sort of assume, I think if you challenge them on this, they wouldn't say it, but I can implicitly, without really thinking about it, we assume that everything somehow has been measured.
Yeah.
Like the numbers are out there. There's some spreadsheet somewhere that's measured everything. But actually, very often, I mean, there are a lot of things in our modern society that we do measure, but there's a lot of stuff that we don't. And often you get asked questions or people make claims about the world.
Yeah.
You're like, no one's ever.
So give us an example.
Well, for example, the classic, that men think about sex every 7 seconds. Like,
how
would you even begin to figure out whether that was true?
Yeah.
And obviously, you realise, well, are you thinking about sex now? Are you thinking about sex now? I mean, like you can't. So it's a ridiculous claim.
Yeah.
So tracking where that claim came from, but also just pointing out some stuff just can't be measured, and some stuff can be measured, but it's just an incredible performance to do it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been a fun journey.
Yeah. So in terms of where we're at now with the economy, how do you think we're doing? What's your view on the UK economy at the moment?
Well, I mean, we've been given degrowth a try for the last 15 years, haven't we? I know people are advocating degrowth. It's been a really, really bad 15 years, and that's not a party political point. That's just because various people have been in charge, and no one seems to have managed to get things going. So it is interesting and encouraging to see a new government coming in saying growth matters, not for its own sake, but because of what it can do for us, the way it can fund our public services or give people more interesting jobs. So growth matters, and we're going to try and do something about it. We heard a bit of that from Liz Truss, which reminded us that it's easy to say and not so easy to do. Yeah. But that, I think, is encouraging to hear that. Whether they'll achieve it. Turns out it's a hard problem.
Yes, well, because if we kind of, looking at the budget specifically and unpick some of that, one of the things that came out that day when we heard all these policy announcements from Rachel Reeves was also the fact that the OBR, who, constantly are kind of assessing what we're doing in the economy and what it's going to mean for growth, are forecasting that it's not going to change very much. It's going to go up a bit, but actually... Yeah. Despite all these policy announcements, we're not going to get greater growth.
Yeah, of course they don't know. I mean, that's the wonderful thing. I remember once talking to a senior economist at the Office for Budget Responsibility, and I was teasing him because I think they'd got loads and loads of forecasts wrong, and he said, "Our job is not to be right. Our job is to be independent." Which for a while, well,
are they mutually exclusive?
Well, no. Actually, when I thought about it, I thought, no, that's fair enough. And we know economic forecasting is difficult. Yeah. We know that the data always come out differently to what you expected. Even forecasting what happened 3 months ago, it's not really forecasting, but trying to understand what happened 3 months ago or 6 months ago or even a year ago. Sometimes we don't even really understand what has recently happened in the economy, let alone what's going to happen. So, of course, they're not going to be right. And if we can't take them too seriously, and we can't expect too much accuracy. And if they're very precise in their forecast, they nudge it up by a few billion or down by. I mean, who cares? But the point is, before George Osborne introduced the Office for Budget Responsibility in 2010. The Treasury could basically just say whatever they liked. And if the numbers didn't quite suit what the Chancellor of the Exchequer wanted to say, he could just change the numbers. And he'd say what he liked. And then later, the Institute for Fiscal Studies would give a talk and say, well, we're not sure we believe these numbers or whatever. But the point is that the Office for Budget Responsibility, they're not going to produce the number that suits whatever the Chancellor wants. They'll come to their own view. And that view is probably going to be wrong, but it's not going to be biased. It's not going to be systematically biased.
Is there really any point to it, though, if it's kind of meaningless, which is what you're suggesting?
I'm not saying it's meaningless. I'm saying that it's their best guess, and there's no reason to expect it to be systematically wrong in a particular direction. So before the OBR, you could expect that the forecast would always favour the government.
Yes.
And would always paint a rosy picture.
But then other people, as you say, would look at it and challenge that.
Sure. So you could say we don't need an independent government agency the Institute for Fiscal Studies is enough.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It seems useful enough, but it's limited. I mean, one of the big limits is that it has to take whatever the government tells it as, okay, this is the policy.
Yeah.
So, for example, before Brexit, the policy of the government was we're not going to Brexit.
Yeah.
And everyone could see, well, that's clearly a risk that it might happen.
Yeah.
It depends what people vote, and but the OBR couldn't take that into account. Or an even more, maybe not so important, but more kind of egregious example. The policy for a long, long time was we are going to put up fuel duty, but not right now.
Yes.
It's going to be it's an automatic thing. It's going to be next year, and year after year after year, chancellors would go, "Oh, we're not going to do it now, but we will do it next year." And so, from the point of view of somebody with a completely free hand, like the IFS, you'd go, "They're not going to do it. Like they never do it. No government's ever. It hasn't happened for years and years and years. They're not going to do it, and so we're not going to put it in our forecast." But the OBR, because of the way their terms of reference are written, they have to say, well, the government says that next year it will raise fuel duty, and so that's got to be in their forecast, even though they don't believe it and no one believes it, but that's what they've got to do.
So the limits. We were saying this the other day when we were talking to Andy Haldane about it's incredible, the kind of motoring lobby groups and the hauliers and everything who've managed to stop them from ever putting fuel duty up over however long now. Yeah.
I mean, well, we can talk about that if you want. I mean, it's an interesting one. I'm a keen cyclist. I do not love cars being on the road, and I personally would like petrol to be more expensive. But actually, when you look at how you might want to deal with cars on the road and maybe encourage people to take alternative forms of transport, what you'd really want is congestion pricing. The real problem is whether they're kind of bumper to bumper. We're not far from the Strand in central London. You just see this bumper to bumper traffic. They're all spewing out pollution. They're not going anywhere. Those cars shouldn't be there. But that's a congestion problem. That's a congestion pricing problem. Whereas, if I'm driving a car through the countryside of Wales, probably I'm paying too much tax relative to the damage I'm doing.
Yeah.
So,
there's a whole infrastructure problem as well, isn't there? Like there's
the buses.
And
yes, absolutely.
Services outside of London.
I have heard that rail services across the north of England from east to west are really bad. Have you heard that stuff?
I mean, I just wouldn't know. It's not like I experience it nearly every day of my life. So coming back then to kind of the big macroeconomic picture at the minute, from what you heard from Rachel Reeves, do you think this is good? We'll go into the specifics of each of the policy things, but do you think, holistically looking at this, that does sound like this is a good plan, this is what's going to get the country growing again? I
mean, broadly speaking, they're going to invest more and we need more investment. So that's a good start. We'll have to see. So a lot of that investment, for example, is going to be building NHS hospitals or stopping current NHS hospitals falling down or buying better equipment for NHS hospitals. I think most people would say, it's about time we saw that. I'm not sure how much growth it's going to produce. Maybe a bit. I mean, if it improves the health of the nation, maybe a bit of growth. But probably growth is going to come from better transport, for example, and definitely from more building. And that's not something that Rachel Reeves's investment policy is going to produce. That's about planning reform.
Yeah.
So I haven't seen anything that makes me think, these guys are not serious. They're going to fail. But it's very early days. And it's a hard problem. Raising growth is a hard problem. The UK growth performance has been really bad, but not the worst in the G7 over the last 15 years. And lots of countries have struggled with lots of different governments trying lots of different approaches. So, it's not like, they just need to press the growth button. Thank goodness somebody's finally pressing the growth button. It's not as easy as that.
Yeah. So, I mean, we love talking about taxes on this show. I know you love talking about them as well.
No, I don't love paying them. I love talking about them.
Yeah. So, I mean, I had a proper moan the other day about the national insurance increase for employers, and everyone's heard me banging on about this, but I was looking at it from a kind of business owner's point of view in particular. You think there's some positive in this, don't you? So go on, give us. I've done the bashing it. You give us the positive on it. Well, apart from just raising money, obviously. Yeah. Well,
I've been listening to you talking to Robert about this, and I don't disagree with anything you've said. It's all totally reasonable, and clearly raising taxes on jobs that doesn't really matter very much in the long run, whether it's the employer or the employee who pays it. In the end, it's a tax on jobs. It makes it more expensive to employ people. That's going to cause some problems. But if you take a step back and go, okay, we need to raise some taxes. Let's just accept that we need to raise taxes because the alternative is like growth comes from magic somewhere. That's not going to happen. Or we cut public services. Well, that's not what people voted for. It's not what people expect. Okay. So we need to raise taxes. So what taxes are you going to raise? The general principle is that if you want to raise a lot of tax, you need something broad. You need to tax some broad area of activity. Now, my choice would not have been national insurance on employers. We can discuss what my choice would have been. Yeah. But that said, the fact that they have kind of, you would say sneakily, lowered the threshold at which the tax is paid, that does really broaden the base because basically absolutely everybody with a job has to pay that. So you've grabbed, it's a good way of, for a fairly modest increase in the rate, you're not increasing the rate very much, grabbing a whole load more extra tax. And so for people who have a job, for people who are employed, it doesn't alter the incentives very much. Most people are probably not going to go, you know what, I'm going to retire early because of this tax, in a way that, say, putting up income tax from 25 to 30. People might go, actually, I'm not going to pay this extra 5p. It has an input on people's incentives. This doesn't, because you're kind of, if you earn an extra pound, you get to keep the same amount or nearly the same amount. So anyway. You can come back at me. Tell me I'm wrong. It's a broad-based thing.
It's because you think it is better for our economy if just more people across the whole scene are paying tax.
Yeah.
Because I read a piece of yours which was talking about VAT, and I was
that'd be better. Yeah.
And it was talking about the fact that actually only half of what we buy incurs VAT.
Yeah. Absolutely, which is different from, say, Denmark. And I went to Denmark recently. It's very nice. They're doing fine.
Yeah.
The economy's doing great. I mean, maybe it's different out in the sticks versus Copenhagen, where I was. It's very, very successful economy. Wonderful, wonderful place to live. Their VAT is 25%, not 20% as it is here.
Yeah.
And it's 25% on absolutely everything.
Yeah.
Whereas in the UK, there's loads and loads of stuff. I mean, most obviously food. But not all food. Not if you go to a restaurant. Not if it's like hot food.
Yeah.
And that and biscuits don't pay VAT, but cakes.
Yes, because there's a great Jaffa cake debate, isn't there? About is it a biscuit or a cake?
I can't remember. I mean, some of the court cases on this are incredible.
Yes.
But the basic point is you could raise a lot of money without really distorting the economy at all.
Yeah.
If you put VAT on everything. Now, what people would say is
that's a tax on the poor. It's things because things like everybody. Children's clothes or whatever.
Children's clothes, children's shoes, yeah. Although the children's shoes, that's kind of annoying. Like if you've got small feet, you can buy children's shoes and not pay the tax.
Person, I'm literally a size 5, so I fall into the children's shoe category. So I benefit from that. So you're right. Exactly. I should be paying VAT on them.
But the point is, it's a tax on everything. It's a tax on economic activity. It's a tax on everybody who buys anything has to pay VAT, which is a very straightforward tax to collect, and there's it's difficult to evade VAT, and if you spend twice as much, you pay twice as much VAT. If you spend 10 times as much, you pay 10 times as much VAT. So I'm not saying the whole of government spending should be supported by VAT, but that I think is a really, really good tax, and tax nerds think that VAT is a very good kind of efficient, non-distorting tax.
Yeah.
So then you go, well, but what about the people who can't afford food? What about the people who can't afford to buy shoes for their children?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think that a tax break on half of what the whole country buys is a very good pro-poor policy. If we're worried about those people, and I think we should be worried about those people, you need better benefits, you need higher minimum wages, you need a flourishing economy where people can find jobs easily, all those things that we want. Very often we find a tax and you go, well, I can identify one person who would loosen this tax, and I don't think they should loosen this tax, and therefore no one should have to pay the tax because it is one person, and that leads to really, really bad tax policy.
What about a kind of there's VAT on everything, but there's exemptions if it's like means tested exemptions?
Yeah, I mean my sense is
too complicated.
Too complicated because the exemptions you immediately get ridiculous. So let me give you an example of the ridiculousness.
I love your faces lit up here because I've got a great example. Go on.
So there was a case recently where this company was making these twin packs of, it was like I think it was a chocolate brownie was one of them was a flapjack, but it was like a workout thing for workout bros.
Right, so like a protein kind of
one of them was protein and one of them was carbs, and I think you had the carbs before the workout and then you had the protein after the workout.
That's a marketing lie.
Yeah,
go on.
So anyway, but that was the thing. But then the question was, is this thing liable for VAT? Because biscuits pay VAT.
And cakes
Cakes don't. Flapjack doesn't pay VAT.
Because that's a cake.
Because it's a cake, unless it's interesting in any way. So if it's flapjack with chocolate on, it's not a cake, it's a biscuit. So basically, it's almost like, well, because flapjacks are the most British thing ever, flapjacks get VAT exemption, unless you mess with them, in which case we'll call them a biscuit. And I think cereal bars are biscuits. They're not flapjacks, although they're kind of like flapjacks, aren't they? Anyway, you had these two judges basically in the courtroom chowing down on these protein bars, going, I don't think this is the kind of thing that I would serve my guests.
That's what
it came down to. And they're like, this isn't nice enough to be a cake. You have to pay VAT. And the company said, well, we're going to close down. We can't afford to. But my feeling is, if you're making a product and you're reliant on the tax break, it's probably not a good enough product.
Yeah.
But that's how ridiculous it gets.
That just seems like it needs reform, though. That just sounds wacky, doesn't it? The biscuit cake debate. It feels like that needs.
But I mean, the easiest way to sort it out is just VAT on everything. And then you've got a lot more room to close the deficit, to raise investment, but also to potentially cut other taxes that are more distortionary. But just to kind of adopt a little bit of behavioural economics, so we were talking about behavioural economics earlier, one of the ideas in behavioural economics is reframing. So let's reframe this, okay? Imagine that we had the Danish policy, that VAT was on everything. And you came to me and you said, I'm worried that some poor families, they can't afford good food, they can't afford shoes for their kids. Why don't we cut VAT for everybody on children's shoes and food?
Yeah.
And I go, there must be an easier way to achieve the policy objective that you want. Can't we raise benefits? Can't we do something that would target the policy aim that you're aiming for, rather than going, half the stuff that the country buys will just not tax VAT, not charge VAT on. And that, I think, if you frame it like that, I think it would seem a weird policy. But governments won't put VAT up.
What if it was, because we've talked quite a bit on this show as well about hypothecated taxes, about, could you sell it, could you market it as, and this is going to make, give a tangible sense of what it'll achieve.
I mean, you could. It is just marketing, obviously.
Yeah, it's everything.
In the end, all the money goes into a great big pot and then it all comes out again. And that's all just marketing. But if it helps, then it helps.
Yeah. Can we talk about income tax? Because, again, we've said on this show before, half of all income tax revenue comes from just 5% of the highest earners. So do you think that there needs to be some type of reform in terms of income tax? Or, if we're talking broad brush, how do you get more people into it? Or do we scrap income tax? Is that another?
I don't. No. I mean, income tax is really important for ensuring that because the tax system is a system. So VAT by itself, let's say you wanted to raise all the money from VAT, well, you'd say, well, the rich are paying the same tax rate as the poor. I mean, they're paying a lot more tax because they're rich, but they're not paying a bigger proportion of tax relative to their income. But that's fine to have that VAT, as part of the tax system, as long as you've got another part of the tax system that's more progressive, and that would be income tax. Income tax is really progressive. I think people haven't quite realised in this country that there's lots and lots of talk about the tax burden being at its highest level, which it is, but not if you're on average incomes. If you're on average incomes and you look at the direct taxes you're paying, national insurance and income tax, I think, I can't remember the exact statistic, but I think it's at the lowest level since the 1970s.
Yeah.
So the tax burden is coming from a smaller number of people who are making a lot of money and can afford to pay it. There's no complaint about that.
Yeah.
But the rich already do pay a lot of tax.
So should that have gone up, do you think? Should we have seen something done with income tax? Because I know the whole ethos was we're not taxing working people, but then...
They said that, and they said they wouldn't do it. But I mean, I think...
indirectly, we all know it is going to impact working people.
So my I mean, this is as much as kind of an aesthetic choice as anything. Like, I just would like this to be simplified. There's so much stuff like your tax allowance is withdrawn gradually when you hit 100K. So you basically, you're paying 20%, but it's not 20% because it's also got national insurance on. So it's, I don't know, whatever, 30. I can't even keep track of it. It's 33%. It's not 20% because national insurance is also an income tax. So it's a 33% income tax when you include national insurance. Unless you're elderly, in which case it's 20%.
Yes.
And then when you start earning more, it goes up to 40% or more because there's also national insurance thrown in. And then when you hit 100,000, it's 60% because you've got your tax allowance being withdrawn. And then it goes back down to 40%. Then it goes up to 45% when you're at 150K.
So complicated.
So I'd like to see a lot of those kind of exemptions and withdrawals just kind of simplified. And I suspect probably a slightly lower allowance, a slightly higher rate, a slightly higher basic rate, a slightly higher rate, a slightly higher highest rate, and just a little bit higher and a little bit simpler for everybody. And people are not going to leave the country if they're paying 45% tax. If you raise it to 46, 47, or if you lowered the threshold from 150 to 125.
There is a point, though, isn't there, where if it does go too high, that will change behaviour.
There is.
Then you'll bring in less money because of it.
Yes, and we should talk about how taxes change behaviour because that's an incredible story. But I think so there's two different ways to think about behaviour change. One is, does somebody make a complete change in their lifestyle? So, for example, I'm going to retire. I'm a parent with a young kid and I'm not going to hire a nanny or pay for childcare. I'm just going to quit my job and look after my kid. Or if I'm rich, I'm going to move to Monaco. So there's those sorts of decisions. But there's also, am I going to work overtime? Am I going to negotiate hard for a pay rise?
I think they hit hardest, I think, is those types of things. The people who are not doing as many. I know loads of people like that where I live who just are saying this is the point at which it's not worth me doing any more hours.
Yeah, so very often it's people at lower incomes who face the highest effective tax rates because they're having benefits withdrawn. And there's a real sort of, it's called the poverty trap. Yeah. This idea of if I earn more money, I actually take home less money.
Yes, yeah, exactly that.
So there's all of that. And those are the reasons why sometimes if you raise tax rates, you don't actually get any more revenue. Because you're losing people, because people are saying, I'll take care of my own kids, I'll retire, I'll move to Monaco. But some taxes do provoke that behaviour more than others. That's the annoying thing. Like, we would all like to tax billionaires the most, but billionaires are the most mobile, have the most incentive to move. And so
that's can afford
really tricky.
All the people to spend hours and hours working out the loopholes.
Yeah. So there's that. The other thing, but a lot of the loopholes, there are loopholes, but a lot of the loopholes aren't really loopholes. They're just kind of, that's the way the tax was designed to work. So capital gains tax is a fascinating one. There's a couple of loopholes that are not loopholes. Everyone knows them if you're making capital gains and you've got any sort of money. So one is, if you die and you give say it's a business, say you own shares in a business and you die and your heirs inherit that, they don't pay capital gains. The estate doesn't pay capital gains. It's re-zeroed. Or if you have a house and the house is worth 10 times as much as it was when you bought it, and then it goes to your heirs, you might pay some inheritance tax on the house, but there's no capital gains tax on that. That's just in there by design. Or if you built up a business and then you leave the country and you don't sell your business, you just leave the country with your shares. Yeah. Again, there's no capital gains tax to pay. Now, those things could be changed.
Yeah.
You could call them loopholes, or you could call them that's the way the tax is designed. But there are plenty of countries that will, for example, if you leave the country with a big capital gain, you get it's like an exit tax.
Yes, I know. Yeah, I quite like the idea.
That seems reasonable to me. But capital gains is tricky because you only pay it when you sell the asset that's gone up in value. Income tax, you pay it when you earn income.
Yes.
There's no wiggling out of that. But capital gains tax, you get to decide when you pay it. And so there's always going to be a lot more flexibility to avoid the tax.
So should there be more like an annual capital gains? I.e. that would probably be a bureaucratic nightmare and people would argue it and everything else.
It's tricky. So for example, let's say you've your business, Steph.
My
the
slime
name?
business.
It's like a slime.
Utopia, yeah. I think people are sick of me mentioning it now.
It's Gutopia.
Yeah.
Okay, so Gutopia or Gutovia?
Yeah, Gutopia. Because somebody had already trademarked Slime Planet, so we had to change it.
Okay, so so let's say Gutopia, let's say you go public, so the shares have got a publicly observable value. That makes life easier.
Yeah.
And let's say it's £10 a share, and you've got 1 million shares. So that's like £10 million.
Yeah.
And then they double. You
Yeah.
have a really good year, and then it's £20 a share. So you just made £10 million in capital gains. Yeah?
Yes.
But you haven't sold the shares.
Yeah.
Then the taxman could come and say,
Yeah.
Steph, you need to pay me like 10% of that or whatever.
I've already got to Monaco at this point.
you need to pay me some of that capital gains.
Yeah.
Okay. So you could sell a few of the shares and pay the tax bill. And then let's say the next year
It
have a really
drops.
bad year. And then it drops back to where it was.
Yeah.
Are they going to give you a refund? Can you go back to the tax man and say, actually, I want my money back now? Because you paid tax on a capital gain that you in the long run you never had. So it's hard.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm not in favour of rich people dodging taxes, but I think we do need to be realistic about why it is sometimes hard.
Yeah,
and it needs to be cleverly designed.
Yeah.
Can we talk about weird ways people dodge taxes?
Yes,
it's amazing.
I mean, but this is it's a whole industry, isn't it? Because one of the things that I am really sceptical of in this, how they're going to raise this 70 billion is the spending and everything is through. They want to get 6.5 billion from tax avoidance, clamping down on that. I just think that is not going to happen.
I mean, they're always going to. The thing is, they always say that, and they can make progress.
Yeah.
So, for example, just kind of the greater digitization of everything makes it easier it's harder to collect cash in hand and hide that, for example. So, there's some of that, and they can employ more tax inspectors, they can do more analysis, they can pay more attention, maybe they can use AI.
All of this costs money though as well.
Yeah. So I suspect that they'll be somewhat successful, but I doubt the full amount of money is going to be collected. It seems to be something that every government says.
Yeah.
And fair enough, it's like a constant battle. You want to make sure that everyone is paying the taxes that they should. And there's a gap. And the gap is the way we think of it is like, oh, it's kind of those billionaires avoiding tax. But actually, people all the way up and down the tax.
There's
all
levels. People who pay cash in hand. There's loads of different ways.
Yeah. There's. I mean, another thing HMRC publishes an estimate of all the different losses. So another thing is just things like are people making little mistakes in their accounts, and maybe kind of like maybe the mistakes are usually in their favour. Just that sort of stuff, and maybe they're honest mistakes, but like you didn't double check. Whereas you would have checked really hard if the mistake was against you. That sort of stuff.
Yeah. So go on, you were about to tell us about the weird and wonderful ways people avoid tax.
I mean, there are some great ones. One of my favourites is the idea of the bachelor tax. The bachelor tax is quite a popular idea, or was quite a popular idea.
What era are we talking?
We're talking the 19th century, the early 20th century. And it makes a certain amount of sense. So you've got two things going on. You've got governments who want more babies, right? They want more children. They want their populations to be higher. That was a big push.
Yeah.
So you want people to get married, and therefore you tax them if they don't get married. So there's the bachelor tax.
Oh my God!
And obviously it's paid by the men, not the women, because women don't have their own income in these times.
Yes, of course, and we don't have our own sense of ourselves.
Yeah.
Even.
So however, one thing you can do as a woman is when a man proposes to you, you can say yes or you can say no. So
you've got leverage.
You've got some leverage. So the problem is you've got the bachelor tax being levied on bachelors. But what if they ask a woman to marry them and she says no? Well, then, first of all, you're a loser, but also you're being taxed. So the taxman's adding insult to injury. Yeah. So then the tax authorities sort of thought about this, and they kind of stroked their big waxy moustaches and said, "Oh, well, we've got to do something about this."
I love the way you just kind of imitated that.
Twiddle. Well, what are we going to do? If a chap is turned down by a lady, we can't ask him to pay tax. So so you introduce an exemption.
It's like a Minger's tax, isn't it?
There's a beard tax as well.
Right, we'll get to that. I love this. Go on.
You've got people who are being... there's an exemption. If you propose to a woman and she says no, and you can prove it, you don't have to pay the bachelor tax. So then in Argentina in the early 20th century, you had women whose job was as a professional rejecter. So you'd say, will you marry me? And they'd say, no, I won't. And they'd say, okay, will you sign this piece of paper saying I asked you and you said no? And, you pay them.
Yeah.
And so you've got professional lady rejectors. So it's just an
I would be
example
bang up for that role.
Yeah. But it's one of those things where you think, the tax might or might not make sense. A bachelor tax might or might not make sense. But the point is that it creates this incentive to do something. I'm going to ask somebody to marry me, and they are going to say no, and we'll get it all down in writing. Like that sort of weird stuff would never have happened without the tax system.
Did it make any difference to population numbers?
I've no idea, but I doubt it.
So what about the beard tax?
Beard tax, this is Peter the Great of Russia. So at the time, this is, I think, the 1600s. Don't write in, I'm probably wrong, I'm not a historian. But the nobles of Russia all had these great big beards, and the nobles of Western Europe were all clean shaven. That was the fashion. And Peter the Great is like, well, we need to be a great European power, so we need to get rid of these beards. But the Russian nobles didn't want to shave their beards off. And so he introduced a beard tax. You had to pay a beard tax or shave your beard. And this is an example of a tax where you want people to avoid the tax. It's like a carbon tax.
Yeah.
We want people to not emit carbon so they don't have to pay the tax.
Yeah.
Here, he wanted people to not pay the tax and instead shave their beards. But some people wanted to keep the beards. And so what do you do? How do you prove to the taxman that you've paid your tax and you don't get hassled in the street for your beard? And so people were issued with these beard medallions with a picture of a beard on to show that they could wear the beard medallion on their chest to show that they had paid the beard tax and were allowed to keep their beard. So
that's like, it reminds me of, I once did this series for the BBC called Made in Great Britain, and it was all about looking at industries that have built our towns and cities and things. So, we were doing things like hat making and shoe making and chocolate and cutlery and steel and all these different things.
Harfords are from a long and proud line of hatters.
Oh, are you? Are you? Excellent. Yeah, because mad as a hatter comes from the hat
there's
making.
that as well.
Yeah, there's all that type of thing. But there was a really interesting thing about shoes and the length of a shoe. This was in the 14th century. And the length of a shoe's tip was used to determine basically a person's social status. And they had rules on this. So a duke's shoe could be 3 centimetres longer than his foot. A baron's shoe could be 2 centimetres longer, but a courtier's shoe could only be 1.5 centimetres longer than his foot.
Do they have rules for those little bells?
Good point. Probably did.
The really famous one is the window tax, which was introduced in the 1600s. And it's interesting. It's a clever tax because you basically have to pay, depending on how many windows you got in your house. And you pay, and it's a higher rate if you got loads of windows.
I've just had a new window put in mine, so I'm like thinking,
fortunately,
thank God we don't have this.
After about 200 years, the tax was abolished. Charles Dickens campaigned against it.
Right.
So we talk about why he campaigned against it, but it's quite a clever tax because previously you had a fireplace tax, a half tax, the number of fireplaces in your home. But in order to levy that tax, the taxman had to come into your home, snoop around, look at your business, and decide how many fireplaces you had. And people really didn't like that.
Is this all because this was a sense of how rich you were, or was it about emissions?
No, not emissions.
About that, yeah?
No, not at the time. They wouldn't have cared about that. Yeah. It was all about who's rich. If you're rich, you've got lots of fireplaces.
If you had,
if you're a poor household, you'll have one.
Yeah.
So if you're rich, you'll have a fireplace in every room to keep your home warm. Again, we're talking 400 years ago.
Yeah.
So the fireplace tax is kind of intrusive, whereas the window tax, you just stand outside your house and look, just count the windows. And if you're poor, you can't afford a lot of windows. If you're rich, you've got loads and loads of windows. So in terms of being kind of progressive and easy to measure and easy to levy, you can't hide a window, it's right there.
Yeah.
It's a good tax. But of course, all taxes create incentives. And so people started bricking up their windows. People started deliberately designing houses with
huge windows.
With huge windows. There was that to show off, but with fewer windows. So you're just like, well, we don't need windows. And you can see them. You can walk around, where we are in central London. Some of the housing stock is very, very old. And you can see these bricked up windows. And what would happen is you'd have these tenement blocks where you'd have several families to a room with no windows. So no light, no ventilation. This is why Dickens campaigned against the
rickets and
window
everything.
tax.
Yeah.
But also it's an important point because the other thing is the taxman doesn't get any money if there's no window. So it's what economists would call a deadweight loss. You don't have the window, which you wanted, and the taxman doesn't get the tax. So everyone's a loser.
So bringing that to the modern day then, obviously everyone's talking as well about council tax and that being unfair. The fact, we've obviously have these bans
tax.
and So how would you do it now? What would your, thinking back to, they've done it from how many fires you've got, how many windows you've got at the moment. Obviously it's based on what band your house is in, which is totally out of date.
And I think I seem to remember, I could be wrong about this, but actually, although the bans were set in the 1990s, or maybe like 1990,
weren't they?
Early 1990s. Yeah. Actually, they're connected to rateable value, and so actually the data is older than you and me. What actual fact about the world these taxes are based on? So you need to revalue people's homes, and that's obviously a big job. But
so how would you do it?
Rightmove is available.
Yeah.
So you could. I've not looked into the details of how to do this, but I know that. People who propose this reckon it's a big job, but it's not an impossible job to evaluate people's homes. And then much more straightforward would be like a flat rate based on the price of the property, or maybe you've got an escalating rate, so it's a higher percentage if your property is expensive. But I mean, it seems to me there's no reason why you could have a property in London that's worth 5 million and a property in Newcastle that's worth 200,000, and they're in the same band.
Yeah.
And therefore potentially liable for the same council tax, but actually often the London one is lower. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. If your house is worth 10 times more, like at a first approximation, you go, well, maybe you should pay 10 times more tax. We could figure out some details. Maybe it's more than that. But that's a very sort of straightforward reform. But also, I mean, land in general. Most tax geeks think that land in general, like the rateable value of land or the rentable value of land, is ripe for proper taxation.
We've talked about like the land value tax.
Land value tax, because land doesn't move. I mean, anyone from the Netherlands will tell you can actually create and destroy land if you're determined enough, but broadly speaking, land doesn't move.
Yeah, and I think as well, like I'm quite obsessed, obviously, given I'm a northeasterner, about regional inequalities, and just you do wonder if you made something which made it more expensive. I know the house property prices already make it expensive to live in London, for example, but if you put even less incentive to stay there and more incentive to move to other places, surely that would help the economy as well, because you'd be forced to improve infrastructure in areas, and because there'd be more people living there and there'd be more sense of needing all this.
It would do no harm, right? It would do no harm. I mean, I always feel with tax, the doctors swear the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. I feel that's your first principle with tax. Like, try not to actively make things worse with your tax system, and then after you've done that, you can start thinking about the clever stuff on the edges, for example, like congestion taxes or pollution taxes. But I think you can get a long way with just designing a tax system to raise a reasonable amount of revenue, being somewhat progressive, so the rich pay more as a percentage of their income, and you just don't have people growing beards, bricking up windows, hiring people to reject them about marriage proposals, arguing over Jaffa cakes or protein bars or all this other crazy stuff that people do.